Muy bien, bueno, Roberto me dio la muy intimidante tarea y el honor de presentar algo acerca de la biografía intelectual de David Grusky. La verdad es que es un gran honor hacerlo para alguien que está interesado en esos temas como yo. Realmente no es una tarea posible para mí, a pesar de todos estos años, leer la obra de David, porque David escribe más de lo que cualquiera puede leer en realidad, ¿no? Entonces es muy complicado, y su acercamiento, su abordaje empírico además es, para mí como lector, mucho más complicado. Entonces voy a decir solamente algunas cosas muy rápidamente y un poco por qué es tan difícil sintetizar algunas de las ideas que David ha aportado a la sociología. Básicamente la obra de David un poco es la sociología, ¿no? Es la sociología de la estratificación, y cuando hablamos de la sociología de la estratificación, pues es en realidad gran parte de la sociología contemporánea, ¿no? Bueno, David es profesor David B. Grusky, es el profesor Barbara Kimball de la Escuela de Artes y Humanidades de Humanidades y Ciencias Sociales de Stanford, donde él dirige el departamento, el Centro de Investigación en Pobreza y Desigualdad. Ha escrito cerca de 100 piezas de investigación, incluyendo varios de estos libros, por lo cual decía que es como muy difícil en realidad ser comprensivo como lector acerca de esto. Desde muy joven, algo que es impresionante es que si uno revisa un poco esta biografía intelectual, en realidad desde muy joven, yo creo que antes de los 25 años, él estaba publicando cosas en los top rated journals del mundo, digamos, ¿no? Y publicando cosas bien disruptivas en términos de los paradigmas de las ciencias sociales y lo que entendemos desde entonces como acercamientos a la desigualdad y a la movilidad social. Él estudió en la Universidad de Wisconsin-Madison, y alguna cosa es más de 2.500 citas, incluyendo algo de lo que llaman citas realmente altamente influyentes, no más de 100 citas altamente influyentes. Realmente es un monstruo en la literatura de las ciencias sociales. Y nada más porque ahora va a hablar, y siempre es muy didáctico, pero quizá vale la pena tener algunos conceptos muy simples, algunos de los cuales ya han estado aquí sobre la mesa. ¿Qué es estratificación? ¿De qué estamos hablando cuando hablamos de movilidad? Estamos hablando básicamente de cómo una sociedad está jerarquizada en términos de acceso a recursos, este acceso desigual a recursos, y cada quien se acerca con los instrumentos que puede a esta distribución desigual de los recursos. Tenemos siempre varias posibilidades. Tenemos algunos enfoques que tienen que ver con condiciones de adscripción, decimos, ¿no? Es decir, las grandes preguntas siempre son: ¿cuáles son los esquemas de producción de la desigualdad o de producción de la reproducción, digamos, ¿no? Entonces, ¿cuáles son los mecanismos con los cuales esto ocurre tal distribución desigual de las oportunidades y de los recursos disponibles en una estructura social? Y algunas de las cosas que se hicieron primero hace mucho tiempo, ¿no? Quizá no debo detenerme demasiado en eso. Es algunas de las formas en que ocurre esta distribución desigual de los recursos tiene que ver con cómo es que se transfieren las desigualdades en términos de padres e hijos. Las personas tienen cierto logro educativo, después tienen cierto tipo de ocupaciones y después tienen ciertos ingresos. Este es el director de tesis de David Hauser, y es la persona con la cual escribió las primeras cosas hace mucho tiempo. No tanto tiempo en realidad, que eso es lo que debo decir que es impresionante, y es una sofisticación de estos mecanismos. Habíamos dicho que educación del padre se transfiere al logro educativo del hijo, y esto tiene que ver con el destino económico del hijo, ¿no? Y ahora voy a hablar un poco de por qué típicamente en el análisis sociológico estudiamos ocupaciones. esos mecanismos se fueron complejizando, ¿no? No voy a hablar demasiado de eso, simplemente voy a decir que lo que tiene que ver con clases, bueno, ahora voy a hablar un poco del tema de clases, pero esos mecanismos de producción y reproducción de las desigualdades pasan por medir algunas cosas. En el análisis sociológico clásico hablamos de clases sociales, ¿no? ¿Qué es clase social? Básicamente es cómo hace la gente para ganar dinero, cuánto gana, ¿no? ¿Qué hace la gente? ¿Cuánto gana? Y en qué lo gasta o invierte, ¿no? Entonces, si hablamos de estas tres grandes mecanismos de la vida social, estamos hablando del concepto de clases, y casi siempre por eso hay una discusión enorme en términos de cómo se agrupan esas ocupaciones y esas clases sociales, ¿no? Yo diría que hay tres tipos de contribuciones. Bueno, es difícil escoger, como dije, es difícil ser selectivo en la abundante obra de David, pero voy a hablar rápidamente de tres tipos de contribuciones: términos de movilidad, desigualdad y pobreza. Y las grandes preguntas que casi siempre están motivando el trabajo de David es cuáles son los mecanismos de reproducción social, y ese es el enfoque de clase social, como dije, ¿no? Entonces, en términos de movilidad ha habido una discusión fascinante en las décadas recientes, en los años recientes, acerca de cómo acercarse a esta categoría de clase social, ¿no? Y básicamente hay tres grandes enfoques empíricos. Uno es el de las grandes clases, cómo agrupamos, o sea, si uno se fija cómo, digamos, la gran pregunta es, en cualquier cóctel quizás, y ahora vamos a hacer un cóctel, pero bueno, sí, hay que en el café, ¿y tú qué haces? ¿Y tú a qué te dedicas, no? Y entonces una persona dice, yo estudio tal cosa, o yo me dedico a tal cosa, o yo soy plomero, etcétera, ¿no? Y cada quien dice las cosas que se dedica. Entonces la gran pregunta es, ¿cuáles son los mecanismos más efectivos de transmisión de las desigualdades desde el mercado laboral, ¿no? Y hay un gran grupo de gente agrupado básicamente en es como la corriente europea, digamos, John Goldthorpe y Brin, que dicen, bueno, mira, en realidad las desigualdades, los vehículos de la desigualdad son muy grandes, ¿no? Los podemos agrupar en un enfoque de grandes clases, ¿sí? Una cosa son las personas que han ido a la universidad y por lo tanto tienen cierto empleo. Otros son las personas que no han ido a la universidad, pero tienen ocupaciones que no necesariamente ocupan las manos para trabajar, ¿no? Otros son el tipo de ocupaciones que sí ocupan las manos, pero no ocupan, junto con ello, gran destreza técnica, ¿no? Entonces, básicamente lo que hacen es reunirlo en 5, 6, 7, 9 categorías. Después tenemos otro enfoque que se llama el enfoque gradual, que es, decimos, bueno, no importa cuál sea la ocupación, hay cosas que ocurren en el mercado laboral, algunos mecanismos por los cuales se desplaza esta desigualdad, y básicamente es cuánto dinero ganan y cuánto prestigio son capaces de producir y de transmitir, por tanto, ¿no? Y David Grusky, junto con otros autores desde hace algunos años, Kim Whedon, bueno, Johnson, otros autores, han estado diciendo, bueno, no, en realidad no, en realidad sí importa, por muchas razones. Importa en términos de cuánto ganas, de cómo vives, qué tipo de ocupación tienes, aún sea dentro de esos esquemas de grandes clases, ¿no? Es decir, no es lo mismo estudiar, y todo el mundo aquí quizá tendrá alguna idea, pues no es lo mismo quizá estudiar ingeniería que enfermería, ¿verdad? No es lo mismo estudiar medicina que enfermería, no es lo mismo estudiar ingenierías, pero qué tipo de enfermerías, no es lo mismo ser programador que solamente alguien que ensambla, qué sé yo, ¿no? No lo mismo ser economista que sociólogo, ¿verdad? Es decir, hay diferencias en términos de todo tipo de mecanismos de reproducción de las desigualdades, ¿no? Y este es el tipo de evidencia, bueno, no es muy claro, aquí se va a ver, pero lo que tenemos de este lado son grandes clases, aquí tenemos microclases, y después dijimos, el enfoque de grandes clases, de clase social, tenía que ver con también qué hacemos con el dinero, ¿no? ¿Qué hacemos con el dinero en términos de estilos de vida? Y lo que están haciendo, básicamente lo que tenemos que entender aquí es que hay
una serie de variables contra los cuales se están asociando estos tres enfoques. Aquí está grandes clases, aquí está microclases, y aquí está uno pequeñito que no se ve, que es el enfoque gradual. Y lo que ellos están mostrando en este artículo, muy influyente en términos de este tipo de análisis, publicado en 2002, es que esta forma de medir, que se llama el enfoque de microclases, es una tabla enorme de 82 por 82 tipos de ocupaciones, en realidad se relaciona mucho más fuertemente con diversos aspectos de la vida social que el enfoque de grandes clases, ¿no? Digo, esto casi nunca terminó ahí la historia. Hubo una réplica de Huerta, hubo una réplica de Grusky, y creo que hasta la fecha siguen respondiéndose en los grandes journals, y uno, digamos, es fascinante para uno como lector las formas en que están discutiendo esos argumentos, ¿no? Esta es otra cosa que quisiera comentar también ya muy rápidamente, son las dos últimas filminas. En términos de las desigualdades, ha habido un gran interés en los años recientes en los Estados Unidos y en todo el mundo respecto a la desigualdad, porque la desigualdad ha estado creciendo, y ha estado creciendo en los países donde no había desigualdad hasta hace muy recientemente, o donde la desigualdad era mucho más sutil, ¿no? México es el campeón, uno de los campeones mundiales de la desigualdad, y hemos estado más o menos acostumbrados a que eso ocurra. En otros países eso no ha sido tan natural, digamos, ¿no? Entonces lo que dice David es, la desigualdad es el resultado de fallas de mercado, ¿no? Y típicamente en tres aspectos: mercado educativo, mercados corporativos, mercados laborales, ¿no? ¿Qué ocurre en los mercados educativos? Tenemos cuellos de botella, ¿no? Ahora les estaba tratando de explicar nuestro sistema educativo, cómo está mucho más estratificado todavía, ¿no? Porque tenemos colegios particulares, tenemos colegios bilingües, ¿no? Los colegios bilingües están mandando gente con brechas casi desde los primeros años educativos, ¿no? Digamos, y esas brechas es muy difícil que realmente se cierren con el tiempo. Pues claro, hay altos rendimientos a la educación superior. Tenemos evidencia de que aún en México, por ejemplo, hay rendimientos a la educación superior. Los rendimientos a la educación superior son más grandes cada vez, ¿sí? Y entonces tenemos cuellos de botella que reducen la oportunidad de los que no tienen, digamos, de realmente ingresar al mercado educativo, a las universidades con una ventaja, de salir con una ventaja, de tener una posición, ¿no? Entonces, como frecuentemente dice David, eso es muy bueno para nosotros, todos los que estamos aquí, ¿verdad? Tenemos más oportunidades, pero es muy bueno para la gente en general. Es muy malo para la gente en general, digamos, ¿no? Otra cosa que está ocurriendo es en mercados corporativos, es que los CEOs están ganando cada vez más dinero, y están ganando cada vez más dinero no porque en realidad sean más productivos, sino porque digamos, las personas que están ingresando a esos círculos son muy poquitas y se protegen. En general hay gente protegiendo, las élites protegiéndose a sí mismas todo el tiempo, en términos educativos, en términos corporativos, pero también en mercados laborales, ¿no? Mercados laborales, otra vez, hay ocupaciones privilegiadas. Yo pensaba en los notarios, uno piensa en los notarios, realmente cuán sofisticada es la mayoría del trabajo de un notario, ¿no? Penetrar a ese círculo tan reducido, una ocupación tan altamente remunerada, es muy complicado. Básicamente basta con ser abogado y a veces ni siquiera ser abogado, pero sí que alguien te dé la notaría, ¿no? Ese es como el chiste siempre, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, la desigualdad, otra cosa en términos de desigualdades, hay evidencia que está, siempre proponiendo David, es la desigualdad de oportunidades covaría con desigualdad de condición, ¿no? Es decir, hasta hace muy poco tiempo lo único que nos importaba era la desigualdad de oportunidades, porque discutir cosas así de desigualdad de condición te homologaba con los comunistas, digamos, ¿no? Pero realmente es muy difícil empíricamente distinguir una cosa de la otra, dice lo que dice David, ¿no? Es decir, ¿por qué? Porque si estamos teniendo cuellos de botella en términos educativos, corporativos y laborales, pues en realidad lo que estamos teniendo son mayores igualdad de oportunidades, que está muy difícil que no covaríen con la desigualdad de condición al final del día, ¿no? Y la última cosa que decir es, otra contribución es en términos de pobreza. Para todo esto David tiene muchísimos datos, yo lo estoy diciendo así como de guitarrita, pero realmente hay muchos datos que apoyan todo esto. Sí, en realidad no, el problema de la pobreza no es complicado. ¿Sí? En realidad es muy simple, ¿no? Tenemos dos causas principales de la pobreza. Uno es que la gente no tiene las competencias suficientes para competir por los puestos laborales, y el otro es que no hay suficientes puestos laborales, ¿no? Es básicamente dos causas que tenemos que atacar, y estamos preocupándonos por lo que David llama una metáfora de río arriba, río abajo, ¿no? Entonces tenemos aquí esta fuente de contaminación y pensemos que la gente vive acá atrás, ¿no? Y entonces el río está fluyendo hacia allá, y entonces dice, bueno, mira, quizá lo que la gente está haciendo es contratar médicos aquí, contratar gente que diagnostique por qué la gente se está enfermando, contratar gente que esté tratando de alguna forma revertir las causas de la revertir las consecuencias, pero no atacar las causas. Y cuando contratamos nosotros mismos, ¿verdad?, analistas de la movilidad social, ¿no?, gente que está tratando de combatir el crimen en las calles, ¿no? Tenemos un país en llamas, y gente que solamente está tratando de combatir el crimen, y en general no se atacan las causas. Lo que tenemos es siempre un enfoque de río abajo, ¿no?, de río abajo, y lo que tenemos que hacer es cambiar el enfoque a un enfoque de río arriba, ¿no? Bueno, por favor, les pido que me acompañen para darle un aplauso a David, para darle la bienvenida.
Well, thank you for the introduction. I have to confess I didn't understand each and every word, but it was very long, and so that was good. I think, but it is a bit disconcerting when I knew you were describing some of my work, yet even so, I still didn't understand all of it. Anyway, my apologies for having to resort to English, but I can assure you that the alternative would be far worse. So, I want to talk a bit about inequality in the American dream, and I don't usually do this, but I'm leading off with a quote from the Pope. Inequality is the root of social evil. On Twitter a couple of years ago, and I'm going to treat that as a hypothesis. I'm a social scientist, and so I don't know that the Pope thought of that as a hypothesis, but I want to think of it as a hypothesis. And in fact, the question is, how good of a social scientist is the Pope? And there's lots of social science trying to address the effects of inequality on a whole host of outcomes. And I want to focus in today on the effects of inequality on one particular outcome that I think is especially important, and that's social mobility. So the very simple question that I'm taking on today is that of the effect of rising income inequality on social mobility. And you might ask, well, why would we care about that relationship between rising income inequality and social mobility? And I think in the United States, we care perhaps in a very special way because of the long-standing commitment, at least stated commitment to social mobility. And you can go back to the founding documents of the United States, and you can see this commitment to equal opportunity and high rates of social mobility, even in play in the country's founding documents. So it's pretty deep into the history of the country, this commitment to equal opportunity, and hence, insofar as we think that rising income inequality is going to threaten our capacity to realize that commitment to social mobility, then we should care deeply. And in fact, President Obama initially focused in his early years as president on the perils of income inequality in and of itself, but many Americans are quite untroubled by rising income inequality in and of itself and don't think it's intrinsically problematic. And hence President Obama switched over later in his term to focus on the possible effects of rising income inequality on social mobility. So he capitulated to the view that at least many in the United States don't care much about income inequality taken by itself, but they do care. They do care about income inequality if it's going to undermine our capacity to to deliver on a high mobility society. And that's the argument then that President Obama emphasized throughout much of the latter portion of his presidency. Namely, we ought to worry about rising income inequality because it's threatening our commitment to social mobility. Although President Obama focused on that argument and pushed it very aggressively, the fact of the matter is that we don't have a well-developed understanding of why the takeoff in income inequality might undermine our commitment to social mobility. So that's what I want to focus on today. Why might it be that rising income inequality is a threat to our commitment to delivering a high mobility society? And I'm going to lay out three, I think, simple and quite mechanical reasons why there's good reason to believe that the takeoff in income inequality is very consequential for rates of social mobility. So that's all I'm going to do. I'm going to give you three reasons with a bit of evidence behind them as to why we ought to care about rising income inequality insofar as we want to deliver a high mobility society. Okay, so here's the first reason. And the basic argument here is that when you have rising income inequality, you're delivering more money at the top of the income distribution, by definition, and those folks at the top are going to use that money for the purposes of purchasing opportunity for their children. Okay? So this kind of argument applies in particular to occupational mobility tables. Tables in which you cross-classify the social class, say, of parents and their children, and then examine the propensities for reproduction within the context of that cross-classification. So if you look at those types of cross-classifications, those so-called mobility tables, I would argue you have to look in the right place to find the effects of inequality on that type of mobility. And what's the right place? The right place is the top of the occupational distribution, and in particular, the professional managerial class. Why is that the right place to look for the effects of rising income inequality? Because those are the folks, the professionals and the managers, those are the folks that are benefiting from the takeoff in income inequality. Most of the increase in income is going to that class, to the professional managerial class, and of course to the capitalist class, but in the context of labor, it's going principally to the professional managerial class. And they're going to be the ones now who have more capacity, arguably, to assist their children, because they have more money to do so. Now, of course, we don't know for certain that professional and managerial parents will use that extra money that they're getting by virtue of the takeoff, that they'll use that extra money to help their kids. They could use it for other things. They could save more, they could consume in other ways. But there's good reason, and in fact there's evidence to suggest that indeed when professional and managerial parents get more money, as the income inequality takeoff is delivering to them, when they get more money, you know what they're doing? They're using it to help their kids get opportunities. So you might think, well, they're committed to equal opportunity. They'd say it would be totally wrong to use this extra money to help my own kids. That's inconsistent with the American commitment to equal opportunity. Well, it turns out they don't really reason that way. And in fact, they seem to be quite prepared to use that extra money to help their own kids. And what do? They're more likely to use it to buy their way into very desirable neighborhoods that will have high quality schools for their kids. They'll use it to buy high quality early childhood education for their children. They'll use it to buy after school assistance in camps. They'll go to Europe and other places for that finishing school vacation. Whatever they think might help their kids, they're prepared to use their extra money for the purposes of doing so. And there's evidence to that effect from a variety of research sources, including this graph here that's produced by Sabino Kornrich and Frank Furstenberg, in which they show that the top decile is spending ever more on their children on these sorts of amenities that will presumably assist in the reproduction efforts of their kids. Okay, so I want to take a look at some data that speaks to this hypothesis. It's just a hypothesis, so the hypothesis is very simple, that when you have rising income inequality of the sort that we've experienced, in which the main beneficiaries of that rising income inequality are the professional managerial class, they're going to have more capacity to help their kids get into the professional managerial class themselves. So I'll use the General Social Survey from 1972 to 2010. I'm going to focus on young workers, because young workers in the most recent period are the ones who experienced the takeoff during their childhood. So if you're going to see the effects of the takeoff, you're going to see it among those young workers in the present day. And because we're quite underpowered for this analysis, we're going to focus on a very simple type of reproduction, just contrasting professionals and managers against all other workers. So you can think of it as just a simple 2x2 table in which parents are either professionals and managers or anything else, and likewise children are, and we just want to examine that odds ratio. We get a little bit more complicated in some of the analyses, but that's the gist of the analysis, that's the essence of it. We're just going to see how that changes over time. And in particular, whether or not when the takeoff hits, we see more reproduction. The models are very simple, so I'll skip over that. And let's look at the results. And I should say this is work that I've completed with Pablo Mitnick and Aaron Cumberworth. And what do we find? Well, if you look at the crucial period, which is the transition from the 1990s to the 2000s, because that's the period in which the effects of the takeoff in income inequality could register. If you look at that contrast, you'll see that indeed there's more professional managerial reproduction in the present day than in the 1990s. And you get about 20% more reproduction for sons and about 40% more reproduction for daughters. So those trends, I should say, we've carried out other analyses, those trends only appear for the professional managerial class. So it's the class that was the beneficiary of the takeoff that is now showing more reproduction. Other social classes that didn't get much out of the takeoff are showing no evidence of increased reproduction. So that's consistent with this hypothesis. We're now carrying out further analyses in which we're using linked census and ACS data, which allows us to have much more power because it's a far larger sample. And I can't yet share the results of those because they have been approved for release by the Census Bureau, but soon we'll be releasing further results that will speak to this hypothesis. Starting with the 1940 birth cohort, okay? So this tells us rates of absolute mobility for each percentile in the origin distribution. So what if you're born roughly at the poverty level, at the 20th percentile? What do you get? How many of those folks end up, when they're age 30, having more income than their parents? The answer is about 93%, okay? So the consolation prize of being born into poverty, at least in 1940, was that you're very likely to end up making more than your parents. 93% of children did better than their parents when they're born roughly at the poverty threshold. What if you're born into the 95th percentile, doing very, very well indeed? Even then, in the 1940 birth cohort, 84% of children did better than their parents. It's a tougher challenge, right? If you're born in the 95th percentile, they're making a lot of money, but even so, most kids in the 1940 birth cohort met that challenge and exceeded the income of their parents. If you average across all percentiles, all 100 percentiles, 92% of kids made more than their parents. So the American dream was realized in 1940, right? Only 8% of kids didn't realize the American dream, defined in the way that we have, right? What about 1950? A little bit of a deterioration, right? You see how the curve has dropped down a bit, which means that rates of absolute mobility are now lower across the board, across all percentiles. So if you're born into the 20th percentile, now only 86% of children beat out their parents, whereas before it was 93%, 10 years prior. If you're born into the 95th percentile, 57% chance of absolute mobility, which is down from 84% in 10 years earlier, right? So you're seeing some deterioration, especially at the top, right? If you average across all the percentiles, 79% of all kids were upwardly mobile. Okay? That's 1950. Now let's fast forward to the last cohort we have, the 1980 birth cohort. What does it look like now? That's the bottom yellow curve, a precipitous drop in rates of absolute mobility from 1940 to 1980 birth cohorts. If you're born into the 20th percentile in the 1980 cohort, you only have a 57% chance of absolute mobility. Your parents are roughly at the poverty threshold. You will only have a coin flip, roughly, as to whether or not you'll beat them. And if you're born in the 95th percentile, only about 1 in 4 beat their parents. Averaged across all percentiles, the absolute mobility rate has now fallen to 50%. It's a coin flip. So that's the measure. Now I want to get back to my key question. How does rising income inequality affect our capacity to achieve this type of mobility? Okay? So the question you might ask is, how can we get back to the very high rates of mobility that prevailed in the past? What can we do? Well, you might think, here's one idea, restore the very high growth rates of the past, right? What you see here is the 1940 income distributions for parents, and then for their children 30 years later when they were entering the labor market. You see this massive rightward shift in the red distribution, which is for children, as against the blue distribution, which was the income distribution for parents. What does that rightward shift mean? Huge growth, right? Average income for the children is much higher. Of course, this is all inflation adjusted, I should say. Is much higher than for their parents, right? These were the boom years. So you might think, if you want to get back to the high absolute mobility rates of the past, we just need more growth. We need more growth like we saw in those earlier birth cohorts. Okay, so let's check that out. We did a counterfactual analysis in which we said, okay, let's take the 1980 kids and let's give them the growth rates that prevailed in 1940, ramping up those growth rates much higher than they actually were. Would that get us back to the high rates of absolute mobility that prevailed in the past? The answer is no. It gets us up to, you see that yellow line, it gets us up to about 61.9%, but that's far short of the 92% that prevailed in the 1940 cohort. So growth alone won't do it. Even if we restore the high growth rates that prevailed in the past, that's not going to get us back to the kinds of absolute mobility that we before had. Why would that be? Well, it's because we have much more income inequality now than we did before. Who's getting that growth? We ramp up the growth, but who's getting it? The very top. So we're lavishing all this income on the very top. They're going to beat their parents, but that's not an optimizing way to go about it if you want to raise overall absolute mobility. You're spending too much of that money at the top, ensuring that they're going to beat their parents. But that's not an efficient allocation of growth, insofar as you just want lots of absolute mobility, right? So that's the core problem. You can ramp up growth crazily, but it's going to do nothing if, say, the only person getting it is the very top of the top, right? Let's say you gave all the growth to one person. That person would beat his parents, right? Wonderful. But you're not going to do a good job when it comes to increasing absolute mobility overall. So let's try the next counterfactual. Let's keep growth at the relatively low rate that it now is in the US, but let's have that growth much more broadly shared. Let's have growth shared in the way it was shared in 1940. So now we're equalizing the way in which growth is distributed across the folks, even though there's much less growth. What does that do? A lot. Growth is still low, but it's much more broadly shared. So now we're spreading out that growth so that everyone gets a little bit of it. In the way that was the case in 1940, everyone gets a little bit of that growth, and a lot of folks beat their parents then. So this is the sense in which rising income inequality is undermining our capacity to have this type of absolute mobility. Yeah, you need growth too, but you can go a long way with even a small amount of growth as long as it's widely shared. So inequality matters for this type of mobility. It matters a lot. If you want to maximize the amount of absolute mobility, you need more equality. You need broadly shared growth. So that's the second sense in which inequality matters when it comes to understanding mobility. We're almost done. But we have a third way, I think another very important way in which rising income inequality is undermining our capacity to deliver mobility. And I want to talk about that now. This is what I'm calling the commodification mechanism. In fact, commodification interacts with inequality. Inequality matters a lot when you live in a highly commodified society. So it's a scope condition, if you will. So let me pad that out. I'm getting ahead of myself. But the argument is that you can get away with a lot of inequality if you're not living in a highly commodified society. But if you are, income inequality is going to be deeply problematic when it comes to mobility. So there are two big forces at work: rising income inequality and rising commodification. And it's rising commodification that gives rising income inequality its teeth. That's the argument. Let me now explain it. So first off, what do I mean by rising commodification? Well, basically there are two ways. There are two ways that you can allocate goods, services, and opportunities. First off, you can just understand goods, services, or opportunities as a prerogative of membership in the society. So you can say it's a birthright, if you will, that everyone should have adequate health care. Right? So that would be a decommodified approach. It's just a public good. But alternatively, you can say we're going to sell health. We're going to sell health to those folks who have the money to buy it. That would be commodifying health. That'd be putting it into the market and saying we're going to allocate it in accord with those who have the capacity to buy it. So you always have to make a decision, right? With every good, every service, every opportunity. Are you going to sell it? Or are you going to say it's a birthright, a public good? The claim that I'm making is that increasingly in the US, and I think in lots of other countries, we're selling opportunity. We're putting it into the market. And if you sell opportunity, if that's something you have to buy, then of course rising income inequality matters a lot more. Because you're saying that opportunity can be bought, it's on the market, now there are folks who have the money to buy it, they're going to do it, and you're going to have a lot of inequality of opportunity. Okay? That's the argument. I keep getting ahead of myself, let me make it more concrete. First off, I want to say I'm going to be defining commodification in a very encompassing, embracing way. Okay? There's a very narrow definition of commodification, and I'll be using that too. It would simply mean that you've got to put money on the table in order to buy opportunity for your kid. So let's say I think private schools are going to deliver the best education for my kids. I can go put money on the table, buy that private education for my kid, and all the opportunity that that private education would afford in terms of getting into college and the higher earnings power that implies. That's just buying opportunity, right? You go to the private school, you think your kid will do better, you buy it. But what if you're a good liberal like me and you think, oh, I should support public institutions? What do? I'll tell you what you do. You go to a fancy neighborhood, you buy a fancy house, and then your kid can go into the public school that's only available to people who have the money to buy the fancy house in the high amenity neighborhood with the great public school. You're a good liberal, but you're able to reproduce your class advantage very successfully. So is that not commodification? Of course it's commodification. It's what I'm calling a package deal purchase. You don't directly buy the high quality public schooling, it's public. But the only way you're going to get that high quality public schooling is if you buy your way into the neighborhood, and that takes money. If we don't call that commodification, I think we're crazy. We have to call that commodification. It's buying opportunity, right? It happens to be nominally a public school, but we shouldn't be fooled by the nominal label. So if there's a package deal purchase of that sort, I'm calling that commodification. There's another type of commodification that I think we also have to recognize. It's what I'm calling the installment plan purchase. So we don't anymore very often have, say, dowries. so you don't directly buy a spouse. But marriages typically entail certain commitments about providing a style of life. And hence, in order to buy, as it were, a spouse with high earnings power, typically the person doing that purchasing has to have high earnings power post-sale for himself as well, right? Because the expectation, there's a normative commitment to provide a certain style of life. You don't directly buy the spouse, right? But you have to deliver on an expectation about providing a certain style of life over time, right? And so it's an installment plan purchase. Here again, I think it's important to recognize it for what it is, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. Why do we care about this? We care about this because buying a second earning stream is very important. If you want to protect yourself against, let's say, poverty, having a second earner is important. And so then you have to ask, how are we meeting out those second earners, and to what extent does capacity, in effect, to buy them affecting who has access to the second earner? Okay. So here's what I want you to. Here's my exercise. We're going to pretend we're very poor in, say, the United States, and of course you want your child to do well, and we want to assess how it is that rising commodification is making it more difficult as a poor parent to secure opportunity for your kid. And in that way, I hope to demonstrate to you that rising commodification is a real challenge of our time. I'll just give you 3 examples, but there are many, many more, I can assure you, just to get you into the kind of thinking that I'm trying to push here. So we'll start with getting married. So why do you want to get married if you're poor? There may be many reasons, but a really important reason is that you need that second earning stream, right? It provides you insurance in case you lose your job. It provides you capacity to buy into a better neighborhood with better public schools. And hence, there's all sorts of reasons if you want to convey opportunities to your kids to want to get married and to marry well. But here's the problem. In the U.S., increasingly, it takes money to buy that second earning stream. So you can see that there's actually a drop in the share of folks who are married across the board. But it's most precipitous drop among those who are poorly educated and hence have very little earnings power. So it's the poorly educated folks who don't have lots of earnings in their future that are having difficulty, in effect, securing a partner who will then provide that second earning stream. So you need money in order to have access to that second earning stream. You need money to get money, and that's the commodification again of opportunity. So that's your first problem if you're poor. It's going to be difficult, and increasingly difficult, to get a second earning stream. And one could also add that it's going to be increasingly difficult to as it were, marry well because of increasing monogamy. It's not just that you're disadvantaged in getting married when you're poor, but you're disadvantaged, even if you are so lucky as to get married, you're disadvantaged in being able to marry someone who's high earnings, and increasingly so. But let's talk about the second problem. We know in the US, and Raj Chetty's been immensely important in establishing this, that what really matters in terms of providing opportunity for your kids is getting into the right neighborhood, where there are, say, high amenities that will assist, in particular public schools, but many other amenities as well. You got to get into the high opportunity neighborhoods. You know that as a parent. That's job one. In the past, in the US, it was possible for poor parents to luck into relatively well-off neighborhoods. Why? Because we were less segregated then. It was less the case that the poor lived with the poor and the rich lived with the rich. Of course, that still happened in the past, but now it's intensifying. It's much more extreme. And so, say in my own neighborhood in Palo Alto, it's just rich people, Whereas 50 years ago, there was a little sector of apartments that were open to the working class, that were priced at a price point that it was possible for the lucky kind of winners of the lottery, if you will, to get into Palo Alto with all the amenities like high quality public schooling that Palo Alto affords. Those apartments are now way beyond the means of anyone in the working class. You happen to be, you have to be basically in the 1% to get into those apartments. And that's just an example of what's happening across the United States. The rich are living in very segregated rich neighborhoods. The poor are living in equally segregated poor neighborhoods. And the chances, if you're in the working class, of actually getting access to a high amenity neighborhood have therefore diminished. If you want to get into a high amenity neighborhood, what do you have to do? Money on the table. And so it's the commodification of neighborhoods that means that in effect opportunity is now for sale. So that's your second problem. You know you need to get into a high amenity neighborhood in order to provide opportunities for your kids, but now we're pricing those neighborhoods at a market price that makes it impossible for poor people to get into them in a way that was once possible. Okay, here's problem 3, and believe me, I'm just starting. I'm going to stop with this third problem, but the number of problems that you face by virtue of riding commodification is extraordinary. But what about early childhood training? Okay, so now we are running increasingly two-earner households, right? For a whole host of reasons, and there are many, many good and desirable features of that structure. But what it means is that if you're poor, you're going to have to buy childcare. It wasn't the case in the past that childcare was commodified. When you ran a one-earner household, in effect you had someone dedicated to childcare, and it didn't put poor people at such a disadvantage because everyone, as it were, had their hands, one of their hands tied behind their back, right? Even equalizing normative arrangement. But now childcare is commodified. You've got to buy it. It's very expensive to buy high quality early childcare. Fine for people like me. We have the money just to put the money on the table and buy that childcare for our kids and afford them all the opportunities that we know high quality childcare delivers. But if you're poor, this commodification of childcare is a deep problem. You don't have the money to buy high quality childcare. And so again, we're putting opportunity on the market, and that disadvantages folks who don't have the money to buy it. And that's just early childhood training. It's the same with other types of training later in the life course, but I won't get into that. So, the implication is that inequality increasingly matters for mobility in the United States because opportunity is increasingly commodified. If opportunity was publicly provided to everyone, it wouldn't matter that there was rising income inequality, right? Because we wouldn't be selling opportunity. It's when you start selling opportunity, it's when you commodify opportunity that rising income inequality matters. It matters because it means now that you need money to buy it for your kids. So we would be just fine with a high inequality regime if opportunity weren't commodified. What makes rising inequality problematic is that it is increasingly commodified. So if I'm right, it means that those types of inequality, those types of mobility that speak to unequal opportunities are going to be declining. And so that would mean, for example, a measure of mobility like the intergenerational elasticity should be declining. That would be the implication of the argument that I'm making. So I'm just going to provide a little bit of evidence on whether or not the intergenerational elasticity is high in the US, arguably by virtue of rising commodification. So just in case you don't know what the intergenerational elasticity is, I can explain it in one sentence and you'll be ready to go. So here's what it is. It's the expected percent change in a child's earnings given a 1% increase in her or his parent's income. Okay? So you can think of it again with the stork metaphor. So imagine you've just been born, the stork is flying you to your new home, right? And the stork has, let's say, two choices as to where the stork is going to drop this new child. Two households. Household 1 is making a household income of X, and household 2 is making 1% more. Okay? So the intergenerational elasticity just tells us how much more the child can expect to earn when she or he grows up by virtue of being dropped in that second household where the parental income is 1% more. So if the child, her or himself, also earns 1% more than would be the case if the stork dropped that child in the other household, then you'd have an elasticity of 1. That is a 1% increase in the parental income parlays directly into a 1% increase in the child's income. Elasticity of 1. If it didn't matter where the stork dropped to, if the expected earnings of the child were the same regardless of which house, the one that makes X or the one that makes 1% more than X, you'd have an elasticity of 0. It would be equal opportunity, right? So the elasticity just measures the extent to which it matters whether or not your parents are making more, okay? My claim is that that's going to matter a lot more in a commodified world, right? Because now we're meeting out opportunity in accord with those who pay for it. So if you're dropped into a household where there's more money, your parents can buy more opportunity, you'll have a higher elasticity. Okay, so that's the reason why this kind of measure is tailor-made for the kind of argument that I just delivered. But here's the problem. We don't know in the US how high the elasticity is. I think that's kind of extraordinary. It's one of the key measures of mobility. There's huge debate because we have crappy data. So in 2008, Gary Solon delivered a wonderful meta-analysis of survey and administrative evidence and concluded that the intergenerational elasticity in the US may be as large as 0.5 or 0.6. That would put us at the high end of all the rich countries. That's very high elasticity. And that was the consensus view, that the US had, contrary to all the stereotypes about the US being a high mobility society, in fact, it was quite the opposite. It's a low mobility society. That was perhaps the conventional wisdom up until 2014, when Raj Chetty and his team delivered the first administrative analysis that delivered on the intergenerational elasticity, tax-based data, which we think are the gold standard data, and the estimated elasticity was much lower. It was 0.34. That puts us in the middle of the pack. That almost makes us like Sweden. So that's a quite shockingly low elasticity, and it comes out of what's arguably the very best data. Now Raj pulled away from that estimate because he thought there were methodological problems, and in fact turned to the Rank-Rank slope, which is a different class of measures, because of those methodological problems. So he wasn't necessarily committing to that measure, to that estimate, but certainly it opens the question. Is the elasticity in the US as high as 0.5 or 0.6 as Gary Solon thought, and as the conventional survey data suggested? Or when you turn to the seemingly gold standard administrative data, is it instead around 0.34? The question, in other words, is it the case that 1/3 of parental income differences are transmitted to the next generation, which would make us almost like Sweden? Or is it the case that 2/3 of percent income differences are transmitted to the next generation, which would make us a renegade country, one of the most unequal opportunity countries around? Has huge implications for policy, I would argue. So there's lots of reasons to be concerned about existing administrative data analyses delivering on the elasticity, but I'm just going to give you one. It's that the analyses that Raj could deliver pertained only to kids who were very young, because the data were only available for recent cohorts. Children around 29 to 32 years old, and there's reason to believe that that might downwardly bias the elasticity. So that's a big concern. So along with Pablo Mitnick and several others, we also analyzed tax data, but we used what's called the SOI sample. The SOI sample is advantageous because it goes back to 1987 instead of 1996, so the kids are older. Now, 1987 is a magical year for those people who care about mobility in the US. Why is it magical? It's magical because that was the first year that the IRS said, if you're going to claim a credit for having a dependent child, a tax credit, if you're going to say your tax bill should be lower because you have a child, you better tell us that social security number of that child so we can check that at least that child exists. They're afraid that people were making up children just to get the credit. So they said, give us the social security number and we'll make sure that other people aren't claiming that same kid or that there isn't even such a kid. They did it, of course, for reasons of revenue, but it's very advantageous for analyzing mobility, because once you have that social security number for the kid, that means you can then find that same kid when they grow up, and then compare their income to that of their parents. So 87 is the first year you can do that in the U.S., and we went back to those 87 data. And that means that the children are much older. They're now ages 35 to 38. And so we're less worried about attenuation bias. So what do we get when we do that? Here's the expected earnings for kids conditional on parental income. It's a very steep slope. It's estimated at 0.56, and that puts us at the upper end of estimates. And the implication is that the U.S. is indeed running a very high persistence regime. So where do we stand relative to other countries? At the very top. We are a renegade country. And I would argue, and this is just a hypothesis, that it's partly because we're starting to commodify opportunity in a way that makes money really matter. That's still a hypothesis. So I'm just going to summarize now, and I'll be done. I've argued that there are three quite mechanical reasons why inequality matters if you care about social mobility. It matters because it provides more opportunity for those at the top to buy. It provides more capacity for those at the top to buy opportunity for their kids. Most of the rising income inequality is going to the professional managerial class, and they're using it to help their kids, to buy opportunity for their kids. Secondly, it means that growth is inefficiently distributed if you care about absolute mobility. Growth is going all to the top. They're beating their parents, but that leaves very little for the rest of us when it comes to beating our parents. And hence, when you run a high inequality regime, you're not going to do well on an absolute mobility criterion because you're lavishly spending all your growth on the top, getting absolute mobility for them, but not for anyone else. And then thirdly, you really worry about rising income inequality when opportunity is being commodified. If you're saying, basically, we're going to deliver opportunity to those parents who have the money to buy it for their kids, then it really matters whether you have the money or not, right? So that's the condition under which rising income inequality matters. And so when you combine, as we have in the US, rising commodification with rising income inequality, you've got a problem. And indeed, I think the evidence suggests that we have just that very problem. Very last slide. What do you want to do about it? I think we have two choices. And there's a lot of debate about which way to go. I really don't care which way we go. We just got to take one of these roads. So road one is to acquiesce completely to commodification. Say it's done, it's over. Opportunities for sale, there's nothing we can do about it. That's the neoliberal dream. We're living it. But if we're going to commit to a highly commodified world in which everything's in the market, including opportunity, we had best provide the means to people to buy it. You can't, at the one hand, say, we're going to put opportunity on the market and then say it's not going to be available to poor people because they don't have the money to buy it. You're going to have to do radical redistribution if you're going to deliver an economy in which even opportunity is on the market. So that might be UBI, or it might be any sort of equalizing regimen that provides the capacity for poor parents to buy opportunity for their kids. So that's option one. Acquiesce to commodification, say it's done, the neoliberals win, but we cannot then renege on our commitment to having opportunity even for poor families, and we're going to have to give them the capacity to buy it. Option two is to say it's not a done deal. We can still resist commodification. We can engage in aggressive decommodification movements. And there are many underway. The healthcare movement in the US is the decommodification movement, saying that healthcare shouldn't be something that's only available for the rich, but that it's a public good. So there are efforts of resistance, right? Decommodifying resistance. And so one could ramp up that commitment and resist commodification. And that would work too. My view is we've got to do one of these two. Pretty indifferent. I'll go for whichever one is more likely to work. But if we don't choose at least one of those two paths, I mean, maybe if you have a third way, I'd love to hear it. But if we don't choose one of those two paths, we've got big problems down the road. I'll leave it at that. Thank you. you.